I sent the message on a Tuesday, 3 hours after my father took his last breath. No dramatics, no exclamation points, just the facts, because that's how I'd been running my life for the past 2.5 years. I opened the family group chat, 5 people, a little thread that had gone so quiet I had to scroll to find it, and typed, "Dad passed away this morning. My flight home is Sunday. Lands at 4. Can someone pick me up from the airport? I don't think I should drive." I hit send. I set the phone face down on my father's kitchen table and made coffee because there was nothing else to do with my hands. The hospice nurse had left an hour ago. The house was very still. I could still hear the clock on the microwave. The one he'd never figured out how to change after daylight savings, so it had been wrong for 6 months. I hadn't fixed it either. It felt like a thing he'd want to fix himself. The reply came in 11 minutes. My brother. Sunday's rough. The boys have their thing at school and you know how the traffic is that time of day. Could you just Uber? Then my mother, 4 minutes after. Why didn't you book a morning flight? Not, are you okay? Not, we're so sorry, honey. Not, we're getting in the car right now. Just that. I sat there in my father's kitchen and read both messages twice. The second time, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I'd still been hoping. 2.5 years of handling everything alone, and some stubborn part of me had still been waiting for them to surprise me. I typed back, "Of course, I'll figure it out." That was all. 3 words. No guilt trip, no explanation. No list of everything I'd managed without their help for 29 months. Just, I'll figure it out. I had no idea how right I was. Here's what they knew about the last 2.5 years. My father had a stroke. He lost some mobility, needed care. I stepped in. Here's what they didn't know. The Tuesday evenings I drove him to physical therapy at Harborview Rehab because the bus took 45 minutes one way, and he was exhausted before he even got there. The medication schedule on my phone that pinged at 7 a.m., noon, and 8 p.m. every single day, including holidays. The fall in March, 3 a.m., an icy step, my phone ringing until I was standing in a fluorescent R hallway in a coat thrown over my pajamas, reciting his blood thinners and surgical history to a nurse I'd never met. The 3 times my director offered me a promotion that required more travel, and I said no each time without explaining why, because explaining why meant admitting how deep I was in. And I wasn't ready to admit that to anyone, least of all myself. The grocery lists, the insurance appeals. The afternoon I sat on hold with his pharmacy for 58 minutes to sort out a billing error that would have left him without his blood pressure medication for a week. And when I finally got through, I was so relieved, I cried in my car, in a CVS parking lot, alone, for about 4 minutes, and then I drove back to his house and made dinner. My brother came for Thanksgiving, one Sunday in July. My mother called every couple of weeks and spent the first 15 minutes telling me how difficult it was for her to see Dad this way. I stopped sending updates to the group chat about 8 months in. Updates produced concerned emojis and very little else, and chasing down acknowledgement was another thing I didn't have energy for. I got very good at handling things. That's the trick of it. You get so competent, so quietly capable, that everyone around you assumes you're fine. And you let them assume, because asking for help from people who've already made their answer clear is more exhausting than just doing it yourself. And now my father was gone, and I was sitting in his kitchen, and my family had told me to Uber. What I hadn't told anyone was that the staff at Harborview had already reached out. Imogen, my father's occupational therapist, had called me the morning he passed. She'd known him for 18 months, his stubbornness, his humor, the way he'd argue with her about whether he really needed the wrist rotation exercises and then do them perfectly when he thought she wasn't watching. She'd known me too, in the way care facility staff come to know the person who shows up every single time. She knew my coffee order from the vending machine in the hall. She knew I always stayed for the whole session, even the boring stretches. "We'd like to do something," she said. "Just small, something for him, something for you." They'd been planning it for weeks. A memorial in the rehab center's courtyard. Memory boards, flowers, his favorite music playing from a Bluetooth speaker. Someone dragged out of the break room. Old country, the kind with steel guitar, the kind he'd played on road trips when I was a kid and I used to complain about. I didn't complain about it anymore. I flew home Sunday. Nobody picked me up. I Ubered from the airport alone, dragged my suitcase up the stairs to my apartment, and spent the evening staring at the ceiling. The group chat had been silent since my brother's text. 36 hours without a follow-up, without a check-in, without so much as a, "How are you holding up?" And I wasn't surprised, but the absence still had weight. Monday, I put on the same black dress I'd worn for 3 days and drove to Harborview. I hadn't expected 25 people. The courtyard was small, and they'd filled it. Therapists and front desk staff. The woman from billing who had fought my father's insurance company alongside me through 2 appeals and a denial we'd eventually won together. A few of his former rehabilitation peers who'd heard through the grapevine and asked if they could come. Older men and women, some with canes, one in a wheelchair. People who'd shared those rooms with him and understood something specific about what those rooms cost you. A man in his 70s told me my father had cracked a joke every time he got frustrated during a session. "Made me feel less embarrassed about needing help," he said. "I thought about quitting twice." His attitude kept me coming back. I stood in the middle of all of them and didn't know what to do with my hands. Imogen spoke first. She talked about my father's stubbornness, which got a laugh from everyone who'd known him. She talked about how he'd insisted on watching Westerns during his exercises, and how they'd rigged up a tablet on a stand for him. She talked about the afternoon he took 6 unassisted steps, and the whole room had spontaneously applauded. Then she said something that made me stop breathing. "We also want to make sure the person who made all of this possible feels as seen today as she made him feel every single time she walked through our doors." I found out later that a journalist was in that courtyard. Her name was Ramona. She'd been working on a feature for months. A piece on what she called invisible caregivers. Adult children who quietly restructure their entire lives to hold a parent's life together, without recognition, without the assumption that they might also need something. My father's physical therapist had mentioned me to her back in February. Ramona had been waiting for the right moment to reach out, and then the right moment arrived in the worst way. She'd asked Imogen about attending the memorial. Imogen had asked me that morning gently, framing it as entirely my choice. I said yes. I didn't have the energy left to say no to anything. A photographer took one picture that turned out to matter. Me at the center of the courtyard, my father's photo pressed to my chest, Imogen's arm around my shoulders, a half circle of staff and strangers around us. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't crying. I was just standing there, present in the way you are, when you've finally stopped bracing for the next thing, because there's no next thing left to brace for. That was the photo. The article went up Tuesday evening. She turned down a promotion 3 times to be there for her father. Last week he passed. Her colleagues made sure. She didn't come home to nothing. Online first, then picked up by the regional paper, then a morning segment on the local NBC affiliate. I was sitting in my apartment eating soup from a can when the messages started coming in. 2,000 shares. 4,000. I put the phone face down and finished my soup. The family group chat was silent for 31 hours after the article ran. I know because I checked, not obsessively. Just enough times to understand the silence was a choice. My sister-in-law messaged me privately first. "Is that article about you? From the Harborview Memorial?" I didn't answer. My mother moved first, publicly. She found an old photo, me and my brother as kids, holding sparklers at a 4th of July cookout, and posted it with the caption, "Family is everything. The ones who carry us through." The top reply came from a stranger. Her daughter carried her father through 2 years of illness alone. Sounds like the carrying wasn't exactly mutual. The post got shared, not by me, by people who read carefully and care about consistency. My brother texted me directly. One message. I didn't realize it had gotten that serious. Why didn't you tell us? I read it, set the phone down, picked it up again. I wrote 4 different responses, each one too much, too detailed, too full of the receipts I'd kept without meaning to. The October text I'd sent, asking if anyone could sit with Dad for a weekend so I could get more than 5 hours of sleep, which had gone completely unanswered. The voicemail I'd left my brother the night of the March ER visit, which he'd replied to with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. The phone call, where I'd told my mother things were getting harder, and she'd said she understood, and then changed the subject to a problem she was having with her neighbor. I deleted all 4 drafts. Finally, I sent, "I did tell you. You just weren't really listening." He didn't reply for the rest of the day. When he finally did, it was 2 words, "I'm sorry." I wrote back, "I know." And I meant it. I believed he was sorry. I also believed that sorry is something you say after, and what matters is what you do with it going forward, and I wasn't ready to figure out what that looked like for us yet. Some things can be forgiven and still not be undone. The messages from strangers kept coming. I've been doing this alone with my mom for 3 years. My siblings check in at Christmas. I thought I was the only one. My husband went through this with his father, and none of his brothers helped. I didn't understand what it cost him until I read your story. We're working on it now. I quit a job I loved to care for my father. I haven't told anyone how close I am to losing it completely. This is the first time I've felt like someone understood without me having to explain. I answered as many as I could. Not quickly, slowly, carefully, the way you answer someone standing in the exact place you were, not long ago. A local caregiver network asked if I'd be willing to speak at their monthly gathering. A hospice social worker sent me an email about resources she wished more family, caregivers, knew about earlier. A woman named Dorothea, who'd cared for both her parents simultaneously and come out the other side, with a nonprofit administration background, asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes to all of it. Not because I had a plan. I was still wearing the same sweatshirt 4 days in a row and forgetting to water my plants. But something real was happening. The kind of real that moves on its own when a need is large enough and the right people start finding each other. The gathering at the Caregiver Network was on a Thursday evening. Folding chairs in a community center room that smelled like coffee and old carpet and conversations that had mattered. I'd come to listen, but the facilitator called on me gently, and I found myself standing up. I told them the honest version. That caregiving is one of the loneliest things you can do, not because nobody cares, but because nobody thinks to ask. That the people doing it have gotten so good at managing everything that they've disappeared inside their own competence, that asking for a ride home from the airport feels like a small thing. And it is a small thing. And somehow that makes it worse when nobody comes. The room was very quiet when I sat back down. Afterward, a woman touched my arm. She was maybe 60, yellow cardigan, eyes that had done a lot of work recently. Her son had died 2 months ago. MS, 7 years of caregiving. She'd come home from his service to an empty apartment and a freezer full of meals she'd prepped for him out of habit. The muscle memory still running even after he was gone. Nobody from her church had brought a casserole, not one neighbor. "I thought it was just me," she said. I drove home that night and sat in my parked car for a long time before going inside. I thought about my father. The way he called me kid, well into my 30s, even when I was the one handling the grocery shopping and cutting his food and tracking his oxygen levels in a notebook I kept on the kitchen counter. The way he'd give my hand a quick double squeeze when I helped him up. His shorthand for thank you when the words had gotten away from him. He'd told me once, maybe a year into it, on a quiet evening on his back porch, "You're going to have to let people in eventually, kid. Can't be the strong one forever." I'd thought he was talking about my personal life. I understand now that he was talking about something larger. Dorothea and I met for coffee, then met again, then started building something. I'd put together a resource document over 2 years without thinking of it that way. Questions to ask at care planning meetings, the insurance billing codes that get denied most often, and exactly how to appeal them. The signs that a parent is declining faster than the medical team is willing to acknowledge. The specific language that opens doors with providers versus the language that gets you transferred to hold music. I'd kept it for myself, updating it late at night after my father went to sleep. It had never occurred to me that anyone else might need it. I posted it in 2 caregiver support groups with a note. I compiled this while caring for my dad over 2+ years. Take what's useful, add what I missed. 300 downloads in the first week. Hundreds more after that, spreading into spaces I couldn't track. Dorothea said, "This needs to be more than a document." I said, "I don't have money or a plan." She said, "Neither do I. Let's start anyway." We called it the Bridge Collective, a support network specifically for solo caregivers, people doing it without a co-caregiver, without family infrastructure, without anyone at home who fully understands why they're exhausted at a cellular level. We built a volunteer program of people who'd been through it, paired with people currently in the middle of it. We partnered with Harborview and 2 other rehab centers to connect caregivers early, before they'd burn down to something unrecognizable. Within a few months, we had our first real moment. A woman arrived at Harborview for her husband's intake appointment. She was doing it completely alone. No family in the area, no one waiting at home who understood the weight of it. The intake coordinator recognized something in her face. I'd once described it at a volunteer meeting as competent and quietly drowning, and handed her our card. "She called me that afternoon," I answered. "My brother came to one of our public information nights in the spring. He hadn't told me he was coming. I spotted him near the back of the room, hands in his jacket pockets, reading the display board we'd put together. A month-by-month timeline of what solo caregiving actually looks like, the weight accumulating in increments so small that nobody on the outside ever sees them adding up." He waited until almost everyone had left. Dorothea and I were breaking down the folding table. He walked over and picked up one end without being asked. "I didn't understand any of it," he said. "Not really." "I know. I want to help, if there's a way to." I looked at him for a moment. This was my brother, who had wept at the funeral and held my hand at the graveside, who had also, for 2.5 years, let me be the only one who showed up. Not from cruelty, I'd come to understand that, but from the very ordinary human failure of not asking, of assuming the person managing everything has chosen to manage everything and is therefore fine. "There's a volunteer orientation next Saturday," I said. 9 in the morning. He nodded. He was there at 8:55. I didn't make it easy. I didn't make it hard. I just let him be one more person in the room, learning what he should have known years ago. That's not punishment. That's just the only honest way I know how to move forward. Not burning the bridge, but making sure that whoever wants to cross it has to do the work of showing up. My mother and I talk on the phone now, once a week or so. It's quieter than it used to be. More careful. Working towards something at a pace that's slow enough to actually hold. She forwarded our fundraising link to her book club. They raised $420, which covered our printed resource packets for a full quarter, I said. "Thank you," she said. She was proud of me. I believed her. I used to think closure was something you received. The right apology, at the right moment, a conversation where someone finally understood what their absence had cost and said so clearly enough to matter. I spent a long time waiting for that. I'm not sure I'm waiting anymore. What I have instead is something I made. Not from the grief exactly, but from what was on the other side of it. The thing that grew when I stopped expecting the right people to show up and started becoming someone who shows up for others. There's a woman in our volunteer program who cared for her mother-in-law alone for 4 years, while her husband traveled for work. She'd never asked for help because she'd convinced herself, somehow, that she didn't deserve it. She coordinates our meal delivery program now. She told me once that volunteering gave her back something she hadn't known she'd given away. There's a man in his 50s who's in the middle of it right now, caring for his father alone. He found us through a post someone shared 3 months ago. He emails every week or so. He's exhausted and a little funny about it, which is how I knows he's going to be okay. There are hundreds of others, quietly holding things up, mostly without recognition, mostly without backup. They find us somehow. Through the resource guide, through a friend who remembered a post, through a rehab coordinator who recognized the look and handed over a card. I answer every message I can. My father used to squeeze my hand twice when he meant thank you, and the words had gotten ahead of him. I think about that often. How much lives in the gestures we never think to name? How much goes unrecognized? Simply because nobody taught us to look for it. When people ask what started the Bridge Collective, what made me build something, instead of just surviving something, I tell them the truth. A Sunday flight that landed at 4 o'clock. A family group chat that went silent. An Uber from the airport to an apartment where nobody was waiting. And then a courtyard full of people I hadn't expected, holding the memory of a man I was still learning how to lose. They usually say, "That's such a sad way to begin." I've stopped correcting them. Let them think what they think. I know where the story actually starts. Not in the silence of that group chat, not in the empty arrivals terminal, not even in the exhaustion of those 2.5 years. It starts the moment I stopped waiting for the people who should have shown up and started becoming the kind of person who does. My father called me kid until the end. He watched Westerns and argued about his exercises and asked me once, on a quiet evening, to promise I'd stop holding everything alone. I'm keeping that promise, just not in the way either of us imagined. And when the next woman calls me, exhausted, invisible, doing it all without anyone thinking to ask, I'll answer. The way Imogen answered for me. The way strangers in a courtyard answered for me. The way the woman in the yellow cardigan reminded me that none of us were ever really alone. We just hadn't found each other yet. That's the whole story, and it's still going.